Welcome to Trench Diaries. Iron Coffins. Part 9.
We remained in the general area for another 5 days. The sneak attack prompted us to keep watch for periscopes as well as smokestacks, but we saw neither. For the second time in a short period, we had been ordered into a specific square to attack a convoy which wasn't there in the end. The possibility of a leak in our security system or in our communications occurred to some of us. Following orders from headquarters, we headed for Grid Square BC-35. Here, together with 2 companion U-boats, we were to form an advanced patrol line that ran from the 48th to the 53rd parallel, passing some 450 miles east of Newfoundland. We arrived 2 days later. By now, 6 weeks had passed since we had left port, and we had become full-fledged submariners. However, our food supply, which was calculated to last for 2 months, had shrunk considerably despite the extra cans we had received from Belgium. Much had landed in the bilges or simply had turned bad. Paulsen quickly solved this problem. He ordered Seibold to reduce the daily rations. As a result, we tightened our belts every other day. On the morning of June 20th, we intercepted a radio signal from Mützelburg, whose U-boat was also hunting in the northern Atlantic. It said, "Have sighted US battleship Texas in blockade area. Ask permission to shoot. U-203. The appearance of the Texas was a remarkable challenge by the Americans, who knew that every foreign ship that entered our blockade area was risking destruction. What would Dönitz' decision be? We wouldn't know. But every single one of us was for sinking the Texas. U-203, still without an answer that same afternoon, asked again for permission to attack. At dusk, we finally intercepted and deciphered an important signal from High Command, replying to Mützelburg's pressing demands. It read, "By order of the Führer, all incidents with United States ships must be avoided in the coming weeks. Until further notice, attacks may not be made on battleships, cruisers and aircraft carriers unless definitely identified as hostile. Warships steaming at night and without lights are not necessarily hostile." This order not only denied U-203 the right to shoot, it was also eventually directed to all U-boats at sea and significantly limited our future method of operation, especially on escorted convoys. As we would later learn, it was virtually impossible at night to distinguish a British destroyer from a US escort. On June 22nd, the broadcast of the latest armed forces communique rocked our boat like a death charge barrage. As it turned out, our armies were on the attack against the Soviet Union and advancing from the Baltic through the Black Sea. This event caused great excitement on board. Our invasion of Russia, which dwarfed Napoleon's attempt in scale and scope, represented a basic and long-awaited German aspiration. As we had been taught, there was no possibility of Germany living side by side with the Soviet Union, because communism, and not England and her Western allies, was Germany's mortal enemy. As everyone knew, the non-aggression pact we had signed with Stalin in August of 1939 was but a temporary measure, a clever delaying tactic. Now that our eastern armies were on the march, the fall of Russia could be expected soon. We had been in Grid Square BC-35 for a number of days without success. Then, at dawn of June 23rd, we received a long-awaited radio message. It said, "Convoy in BD-15 on course east 10 knots. All U-boats in vicinity to operate on target with highest speed." Immediately we calculated our chances, and they were excellent. So U-557 began pursuit. It developed into a tense and thrilling hunt. We plowed southeast at 18 knots to intercept the convoy in about 22 hours. The day passed, and night promised a new encounter. The sky was dark, the air was crisp, the sea choppy and black, a perfect night for a surprise attack. But not a single shadow appeared. When day dawned, we saw nothing but an endless stretch of sea. According to our fix, we should have met with the convoy 4 hours before. Not knowing in which direction to search, we ran huge zigzags on an easterly course, trying to see beyond the sharp line of the horizon. At 09:15, we received new instructions from High Command. First U-boat making contact with convoy must report all pertinent information before attack, it said. We were also advised that 4 other boats were heading toward the convoy. With eyes strained, we scurried eastward for the entire day without seeing a smudge in the sky. It was as though the convoy had never existed. Also, the high-speed run had considerably reduced our fuel supply, and we knew we would not be able to go west again. At 21:35, a scream came through the hatch. "Captain, to the bridge! Shadows ahead!" Paulson, wearing sunglasses to protect his eyes from the lights in the hull and thus be ready for a nighttime emergency, raced up the ladder onto the bridge. Moments later I heard his call, "Battle stations! Prepare for surface attack!" I bounded into position behind the captain and realized that we had crashed into the rear of the convoy. The first thing I saw was a destroyer on parallel course, a faint shadow only. Paulson outmaneuvered this threat, leaving her starboard astern. Visibility was but 3,000 meters. We clung to the fringes of the convoy only until the captain had determined all target values. Seibold radioed our findings to base, and then U-557 surged ahead into attack position. 2 giant shadows mounted on port. Another phantom appeared starboard ahead, with a mean distance of only 600 meters. The vessels on port overlapped each other. Excellent targets. Paulson screamed a few commands and U-557 slowed down. 8, 9 shadows lumbered closer through the long breakers. The captain ordered Cairn, the XO, to shoot. At that moment I spotted a destroyer. No, 2 destroyers, cutting through the curtain of darkness astern. Angle on bow, 0. I desperately wanted Cairn to shoot, so I waited a few seconds until I gave my report. When I could no longer contain myself, I shouted, "2 destroyers in attack position." Paulson swung around and faced the menace. "Jesus Christ, XO, shoot!" Suddenly, star shells and parachute flares drenched our boat in daylight. We saw that we were trapped. The 2 hunters were closing in astern, and a third one raced up amidshit from behind the freighter. There was no escape on surface. We were squeezed between a giant pair of scissors. "Alarm!" The captain's call was drowned in the shriek of the bell. U-557 dipped her bow into the inky sea. Simultaneously, a thunderous explosion lifted the boat by the stern, shook her violently, and turned her wildly off her axis. U-557 was out of control and fell fast. "All stations, damage report. Aft compartment, nothing. Bow compartment, nothing. The dive planes are jammed. There's leak in the diesel compartment. Starboard motor out of order." 4 hellish eruptions threw the boat around like a toy and forced her deeper into the depths, making her sway and tumble on the way. Men skidded along the deck plates. In the flicker of emergency lighting, I saw the needle of the depth gauge waver at the 152-meter mark, then move rapidly to 160, 180 meters. The thrashing sound of a destroyer came nearer, and the footsteps of its racing screws seemed to drum loudly against the steel of our hull. All eyes looked upward. The swishing of propellers reached a crescendo as the destroyer passed over our boat. "Rudder hard a starboard," shouted Paulson. "Port motor half ahead." 3 depth charges exploded, seemingly just above the conning tower. After each shattering roar, the hull moaned, the floor plates jumped and kicked our feet, wood splintered, glass disintegrated, food cans flew the boat, and then all was black for long seconds. When the emergency lighting came on, we were surprised to find out that the hull itself held tight. Only the gaskets and the seats of many valves had loosened, letting water trickle into the bilges in countless little streams. The force of the detonation had pressed the boat deeper, and the influx of water drove her still closer to the limit of her design. The escorts grouped for another attack, their ass-stick chirping relentlessly. The minutes stretched into endless agony, and we hardly risked breathing. Suddenly, 2 distinct explosions came from the direction into which we had heard the convoy disappear. Other U-boats had arrived. But elation gave way to horror as the 3 escorts rapidly neared our position. One by one they churned over our coffin, each dropping a final death charge like flowers upon our grave. The 3 fiendish bursts only deafened our ears, for U-557 was now too deep for charges to damage her. Only depth itself could have collapsed her hull. 2 hours later, we resurfaced, shaken and exhausted. The fresh air speedily revived the crew, then we inspected the damages. They were greater than we first assumed. The starboard electric motor was knocked off its foundation, the aft ballast tank was ruptured, and the starboard shaft was bent. This meant the end of our patrol. U-557 began to crawl 1,600 miles to her new home base, Lorient in western France. The spirit of the crew had been catapulted to the highest peak by our latest success. We did not mind the scars our boat had received. The 8,000 tons of British shipping we had sunk was a vital contribution toward the defeat of Great Britain. So, this brings Herbert's first patrol to its close, and as usual I shall tell you a few discrepancies between the books, some historical context, as well as some findings from U-557's war diary. First off, again, the English book has a few things that were added and a few things that are omitted. For example, when Herbert talks about the invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941, for some reason he starts talking about how this will surely bring forth the Thousand-Year Reich. This struck me as being out of character for him, and truly, in the German book, as it turns out, he doesn't mention the so-called Thousand-Year Reich at all. He just says that the invasion was something that everyone had anticipated and that communism was the enemy. Then, when they prepare for surface attack and get surprised by the escorts, in the English version the XO lets off 3 torpedoes before they commit to their emergency dive, which of course doesn't happen in the original, so I took the liberty to go with the original sequence of events in this episode. At this point I want to talk real quick about Kaloin Mützelburg, the captain of U-203 who you've heard about. Mützelburg was a bearer of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and as such a highly decorated soldier. What became of him, you might ask? Well, his fortune wasn't the best, unfortunately. He died on September 11th, 1942 while on patrol, but not while fighting the enemy, but actually during a swim call. Swim call is when the crew of the U-boat gets to have a bath in the ocean. And believe it or not, he dove from the bridge into the ocean, and during a sudden movement from the boat he slipped, hit his head on a saddle tank, broke his skull, and died. So next to U-1206, which sank because somebody used the toilet wrong, which in turn flooded the boat, this has to be one of the more ridiculous events that happened in the U-boat force during the war. And finally, U-557's war diary, highly interesting as usual. Next to the failed attack, there are a few things that are worth mentioning. So for one, U-557 at some point gets attacked by an enemy U-boat again, but manages to avoid the torpedo, and as a counterattack they just race along the torpedo trail towards the intended or expected diving position, and in an attempt to force the enemy submarine to the surface they just start dropping hand grenades along the path, and this is unsuccessful and the enemy sub escapes to the west. They also detect a huge ship during a night 2 days before U-203 sends her report about the USS Texas, which Paulson at that point during the night already assumed to have been an American warship. There are tons and tons of notes in this specific diary. Covering all of them would take way too long in this context, but just maybe 2 more for your enjoyment. At some point they receive a message from U-96, the boat which you probably all know and which is depicted in the film Das Boot, where they report the attack on a convoy. And Paulson here writes down his thoughts on the matter, and he's a bit grumpy, obviously, because in his opinion U-96 should have waited for other boats to join him before attacking. And lastly, at the end of this patrol, the war diary was signed off by Konteradmiral Goth, Rear Admiral Goth, just so you know, the man in charge of Submarine Operations Command at the time, and also second in command to Karl Dönitz himself, the commander of all U-boat forces, or the BDU as it is known. And funnily enough, Paulson gets admonished within this sign-off for recklessly endangering the boat by engaging another submerged vessel with hand grenades, the incident I talked about just before. I find this to be typical insolent general staff officer behavior, and I like to imagine that Paulson thought the same. Anyway, that's it for this episode. Thank you for watching. If you liked it, you know how the YouTube algorithm works, so like, comment, subscribe. I read every single comment and it means a lot to me. Cheers!